Hi, this is Voices of Adoption. I'm Janet Sherland, author of Abandoned at Birth, a memoir about the adoptee experience. I'm talking with experts and adoptees about the way adoption has shaped our lives and the misconceptions about adoption. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Marcella Moslow, a highly accomplished and passionate professional in the field of trauma therapy, adoption, and family care. Marcella is certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing and is an EMDRIA approved consultant, as well as a registered play therapist, educator, consultant, and trainer. With years of experience, she runs a private practice specializing in therapy, consultation, and training for adoptees, their families, and providers working in this unique community. Her expertise spans across attachment, the complexities of international and domestic adoption and foster care, disassociation throughout the lifespan, identity, neurobiology, and complex trauma. Welcome, Marcella. I am so excited to have you here. I discovered you myself on Instagram, and I was really taken with your posts. They really spoke to me as an adoptee, and I just thought you had the most thoughtful and compassionate comments and posts, and just was immediately drawn to you and eager to meet you and learn more. But before we really start talking back and forth, please let the audience know a little more about yourself and your work.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm just taking a second to let all of that soak in. I love when people are able to resonate with anything that I post or anything that I share, and just take that as such an honor. So I appreciate that. I can sum up the intro that you gave was wonderful. The only thing that I would add is, obviously I have built a private practice specifically working with adoptees and those touched by adoption. I would be remiss in not bringing up that I also have my own lived experience that is part of why I went into this career, why I wanted to specialize with this population. I'm an adoptee myself and was adopted from Colombia as an infant. So I have the international and interracial adoptee experience. I'm also in reunion, so navigating that complexity of adoption. And I bring all of those facets of lived experience into my clinical work and into my consulting with adoptees and their families and people that are really wanting to provide quality care to individuals within this population. So really passionate about this work, and I'm really hopeful that conversations like these can help just shed more light on the complexities of the adoptee experience and really help to shape better care for adoptees and those touched by adoption.
Well, I think that's one of the things that really drew me to you and to what you're posting, because you were an adoptee. And I find in the years that I've been talking publicly about this, that is such a unique experience. And it is so difficult for many of those outside of, well, even within the constellation who aren't adoptees, to really understand that. And I've really been spending all my time trying to find the words and the passion with which to, and my book, I hoped to share the emotions of it, to really capture what it felt like to be adopted. And I think for anyone seeking your professional services as an adoptee, you would just feel so safe and so seen and heard, knowing that you'd experienced that as well. And I wonder, how difficult is it to really enable the parents? So assuming that, are most of your clients children or young people, or?
So I see everybody across the spectrum. Obviously, I do have a chunk of my caseload that are minors. So in those cases, adoptive parents and first family members are involved in whatever capacity is safe and is possible. But then I do also see adults where they have more say in terms of who's involved in their treatment.
When you're dealing with young people or minors, I can imagine that the beliefs and the preconceptions of adopted parents are very instrumental. I know in my own case, I just didn't feel free to be honest about what I was feeling and going through, because I loved my adopted parents and I didn't want to hurt them. And so I was really silenced in that regard. And I found when I'm speaking to people in the past year, there's still a lot of real misconceptions, especially on the part of adoptive parents, about what their children need, what they're going through. And the bias is still to protect the adoptive parents more than to allow the growth and safety and freedom of the adoptee. How do you handle that when you're how difficult is it to help the adoptee if within their adoptive family, they don't understand what they're going through?
The shortest answer I can give is it's very difficult. And I think that that is one of the biggest challenges that I see when working with clinicians in working with this population is when you are bringing a minor adoptee into the mix, we have to be working with the entire system, ideally. And sometimes those systems are not attuned to the actual lived experience that that adoptee is going through. And so there's a lot of moving part and there's a lot of learning and deconstructing and, reimagining that has to be done on all of these different levels. And so it's a lot to have to balance when you have one identified therapy participant, but so many people that are involved that are shaping this child or this minor's experience. And so that is something that as an adoptee clinician as well, I have to constantly be doing my own work because there are times that adoptive parent stuff triggers my own stuff. And I have to be able to be boundaried enough to know that my experiences can't taint what is going on within that other family and their family system.
It is so difficult. It is such a lonely and sad experience to be an adoptee and to not have our culture understand us. And just the other night, I was speaking again, and some of the questions I had from adoptive parents in the audience, just remind you over and over again how little is understood, how we still believe that it's nurture, not nature, how we still think that love is enough. And, it's very hard to get the wider world to listen to and understand. And it's not just for adoptees, but I think the issues that we grapple with and that we've been confronted with our whole lives really are important issues for everyone to understand about themselves and their identity and their biology and their families. It is stuff we don't talk about. We certainly don't value or recognize in our society. One of the things I talked about in the introduction was your work in neurobiology. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how you use that in your practice?
Yeah, so I think what's really important for people to attune to is when we're talking about the adoptee experience, we're talking about complex trauma, which is a level of neurodivergence, right? And our brains are literally built differently. Our nervous systems are literally built differently because of these experiences that we had to endure. And so for anybody that is working with adoptees, and if you are going to be parenting or in the life of an adoptee, it's really, really key that we understand things from a neurobiological perspective, because if we don't, it can be very easy to start to stigmatize. And that's where we start to see a lot of misdiagnosing. We see a lot of labeling happen. We see a lot of judgment and just shaming that's going on for our community. But if we're able to fundamentally take a look at the ways in which the neurobiology plays a role, it can really release some of that stigma and really help to provide more quality and attuned care and support.
Yeah, that's terrific. I so wish this kind of information had been available when I was growing up. There was nothing. I was adopted in the 1950s, and no one talked about any of this or knew any of this. Starting at age 12, I suffered terrible panic disorder for another 10 or 20 years after that. And I wish I had understood more about my nervous system and why it was what it was. And my parents could have understood that. The doctors could have understood that. So I'm so glad that that's being talked about now. Do you find it still being met with skepticism?
I think that there have been strides, right? I think that there have been strides in terms of the level of information that is out there and people's receptiveness. I think that there's still a lot of barriers, right? I think that adoption as a whole is still seen in such a pigeonholed way, and there are still such rampant narratives that are really, really one-sided, that even if we put all of the science and all of the research out on the table, there is still such a level of cognitive dissonance that we're dealing with when we're talking about adoption and how society views adoption, how adoptive parents view adoption, how clinicians and practitioners view adoption. And so I think those are still really the barriers. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of discomfort to really dive into the realities of adoption and the realities of the adoptee experience. And I think that as a whole, our society has a very low bandwidth for things that make us uncomfortable. And so that it works to the disadvantage of adoptees is our experience is deeply uncomfortable on a lot of different levels. And if those around us don't even have the capacity to hear about some of this discomfort, how can we possibly feel safe enough to go there and to actually heal some of that discomfort? And so it leaves us in kind of a stuck spot.
It really does. And that's so true. I found there were a number of friends and people I knew who, when they read my book, were very uncomfortable. They don't want to hear that they don't want to hear the negative and the sad and the sorrow. And a lot of them kept saying to me, well, are you all better now? There's no all better with this. It's
There's not. No.
Living with grief. No, but it was interesting to me how I was talking about my life very honestly, and I'm clearly managing it at this point in my life. And it made them so uncomfortable to hear about it and to listen to the ways I'd struggled. I find that that's one of the biggest frustrations is this inability for people to listen to the trauma of adoption, but see it in other than a Hallmark perspective, see it other than loving parents, well-to-do parents taking a poor, needy child and they live happily ever after. And when we start talking now about destroying one family of lesser means and power to give a child to a family of higher means and power, when you try and rank which trauma is better, a child maybe being raised in a family without the same means, or a child being traumatized by adoption and raised in a family that doesn't understand that. And so many of the kind of industry, the billion-dollar industry that adoption is, or the religious and political lobbies for it's people really have a hard time taking that in, and thus just want us to go back to being the grateful adoptee.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be grateful if we had a positive adoption, but we can also be traumatized at the same time. Two things can be true at once.
Right. And I think that's the epitome of the both and of adoption. And, to the point you were making is, it would be a different experience, right? I think that one of the really big misconceptions is that adoption is always better when it's different, right? If I had stayed with my first family, yes, there still would have been really hard things and really difficult, traumatic stuff that I would have had to deal with. It would have been different, right? And I still had to endure different kinds of trauma being here and brought to a country that was not mine, surrounded by people that do not look like me. And so it becomes this impossible, like one isn't better than the other. They're just inherently different.
Also, when people act like they're saving a child through adoption, even a biological child born and kept in their biological family faces trauma. I mean, no family, you don't come into a family and say, gee, I don't want any mental health or addiction issues in this family. I don't want any anger issue. I mean, everyone born into every family has to deal with their whole wide community of that family deals with. And they manage it well or they don't manage it well, but that's part of their lives. And this fantasy that you can take a child away from anything and give it to a family that has no issues just because there may be two parents and a better roof over their heads is very hard for people to let go of. And they really have a hard time. They very much want to equate better financial resources with less trauma. We certainly should be beyond that at this point. We
should. It would be nice, but I think that is where, again, more of those uncomfortable conversations come into play, right? The uncomfortable conversations aren't just in that small little circle of knowing that child's history or knowing the first family's history. It's having to really learn and really get comfortable digging into things like racism, getting involved in conversations about colonization and the impacts of that, of just the way that industries are formed and the ideas, especially in this country, of capitalism. Like all of those isms play roles in the context of adoption. And I understand that for many people, it can be daunting, right? It is daunting for us as adoptees to have to lean into all of that and learn and be able to get to a place where we can be really vulnerable and speak from a place of truth. And we also need other people to be willing to take that journey alongside of us, because it is not something that we asked for. This is not something that we signed up for. It is absolutely within our capacity, and it is our responsibility to heal and hopefully not perpetuate some of those wounds and things like that. But we need, an overhaul of more than just us and our community doing that deeper work and questioning things and being able to really critically think. I think that is another big barrier point when it comes to adoption and just societally as a whole. We're averse to critically thinking about things, and critically thinking is a must when it comes to adoption.
Yeah, it really is. And you mentioned so many really powerful issues that certainly play into in your experience with, international, interracial adoption. I had the easiest, quote unquote, experience of adoption, being adopted in the 1950s, white baby into white family. And I had a hard time. I've always said I can't imagine what comes with all the loss of your cultural identity, your history, your heritage, when even more has been taken from you. I felt it enough, feeling that I was, turns out I'm Irish, but I grew up in a family that was Swedish and French German. And I felt I didn't even know what I was, but I knew I wasn't what they were. And that felt like a loss to me.
Of course.
We went through a period in the 70s where there was really that vogue of adopting children from another country, another race. And you were there was that sort of, savior, love is everything, nurture is going to change the world kind of feeling. But how much of your work is done with international interracial adoption, and what additional challenges do you find as a therapist? Obviously, you can personally relate to it, but what differences might there be in that work than work you do with someone who's not facing that challenge?
Yeah, so for myself personally, a large part of my caseload are people that are adopted either internationally or domestically, but it's still an interracial, transracial adoption. They're, moving into an adoptive family that does not share their same race. So that's a large part of my caseload. And it's obviously a population that's near and dear to my heart. I think that there is this added pressure to assimilate that we're having to tackle. There are so many extra layers of identity. There are so many extra layers of loss. There are so many extra layers in terms of what cultural norms are. And then we're dealing with, things like racism and stereotypes and microaggressions and all of those kinds of things. And in terms of the adoptive parents, right, we're in a situation where parents can't rely on their own lived experience to then help support their child effectively. And so then we're kind of in this space where the child really is critically not getting some of the things that they need, some of that mirroring, some of that support, some of that stuff that cannot be taught and cannot just be learned. And I think that is, it just speaks to the added complexities of those kinds of adoptions that oftentimes are chalked up to, well, you're now in America, so things are now better. And just really minimizing in terms of all of those things I just listed, because the general consensus is, well, you're here now. All of that stuff doesn't matter. Keep plugging forward. And then we're just leaving people that are fundamentally, like you said earlier, just feeling really unseen and unheard in their experience.
Yeah. It is this sense of the sort of biology of belonging, I've referred to it as. And it is so, we literally don't believe this and talk about this in the United States, certainly, but time and time again, even individuals who say were raised in a, happy home, often cases the people I'm talking to maybe found out later in life they were either adopted or they had been conceived with a sperm donor that they never understood. And even though they had a happy life and a healthy parents, even two parents, when they find that out, they are shattered and they are compelled to find out who they are. And even donor conceived individuals, which Americans kind of go, well, they know one parent and it doesn't matter who their father is. They shouldn't need to know that. And yet people I know that are in that situation are just driven as I was, to find my parents, to meet the father, not to parent them, but to know themselves. And it is such a deep, primal, fundamental need that, and our society just doesn't recognize it. And if you haven't experienced the loss of that, like if you have that, you think it's not important. But when you don't have it, and it's not just because of the way you grew up, like I said, people who find out as formed adults, their truth was different. They are just driven to find the truth. It's so fundamental to us and probably a reflection of our culture. I think there are other cultures where they understand that need to know who you are. It's called a birthright. And when we're adopted, our birthright is taken from us and we're defenseless against that. I recently was told that when in the state of New Jersey, where I was adopted, there were issues there. You can now apply and get your original birth certificate, but that wasn't the case until about 4 years ago. And even then, that was a really fraught journey. One of the groups that fought opening birth certificates was the ACLU. And I thought, wait a minute, aren't they a group that defends individuals' freedoms and rights? And here they were lobbied against opening of the records, probably in protection of adoptive parents. But how about those of us individuals, not helpless infants, but individuals whose rights to our birthright and the normal, natural, authentic identity was taken from us when we were defenseless? I was shocked at that fact. And I found it very disturbing because it's such a deep indication of where our adoption community is centered still. It's centered on making the adoptive parents feel more comfortable and protecting them. The adoptees are seen as helpless babies who don't know what's happening to them and for whom love is enough.
Right. And I think, unfortunately, right, that narrative doesn't just stay that way when we are those small babies or small children. That's actually something that we see carries into how people treat us or view us as adults, right? Still viewing us as helpless, still viewing us as not being able to make the decisions that are in our best interests, still, placing that stigma or that idea that, the adoptee needs to be saved, even though they are an adult and capable and able to do things on their own and fundamentally know what they need the best. Because I agree wholeheartedly that that sense of belonging is a birthright, and it is something that as human beings, we are biologically wired to connect and to know where we come from. And those are such big pieces in being able to grow and being able to flourish and being able to then figure out what comes next and how we move forward. When those aspects of our life are erased or kept from us, there's no wonder that there are negative side effects that then end up getting pathologized and stigmatized, when actually these are really natural, normal, quote unquote, reactions to the losses and the injustices that we have had to endure.
Yeah. I was really surprised in my own experience when I met my biological parents, how complete and found I felt, even when I knew nothing about them. I mean, it was such a biological, visceral response. It was like my cells recognized their kin. It was just like, oh my gosh. And I couldn't have answered 3 questions about the person I was meeting. And even in the case of my biological mother, who didn't want to know me, and really, I finally met her, but she really kept me at arm's length. Even when she was emotionally keeping me at a distance, my body felt seen and found and like it belonged, like I was like, yeah, that's where I come from. So it's hard to describe to people the sense of identity and belonging you feel from some visceral chemical experience of connection with your kin and your family. And you never have that as an adoptee. And it is so fundamental to being an integrated and healthy human being and not yearning and searching for your whole life. Some of the things that we talked about in the introduction to you is play therapy. How does play therapy help adopted clients?
Yeah. So play therapy is basically for children. It can be used for people of all ages, however. It's basically using play, right, the language of children, to help to process through things, to help to integrate, to help to have them be able to connect with a sense of themselves, right? All of which are hard to do when trauma has been experienced. So trauma, especially when for many adoptees, this is happening before there was actual language to describe what was going on, or there was just no narrative that was provided in terms of giving context to this experience. Play therapy can become this really beautiful outlet for allowing children and people older than that a way to describe that, a way to voice that, a way to show right through the play what is going on within their internal experience, and allowing that to be seen and heard and witnessed in a way that is non-judgmental, that is not, looking for certain outcomes or things like that. There's so many benefits to it for adoptees in particular, because this is such an experience that, like you were saying earlier, it's really difficult to have words for it. Even as adults, it's difficult for us to have words. But sometimes being able to show and work through that at a little bit of a distance, right, is really helpful in terms of helping to modulate the intensity of what's going on and helping to be able to slowly give a narrative for those experiences, which then moving forward for that child or that individual helps them to fill in some of those gaps instead of just having a lot of blank spaces.
You find there are one or two dominant issues. I mean, there's so many for those of us who are adopted, but sort of over your practice, do you find that there's sort of consistently one or two issues that are the ones you're tackling the most with clients, or that you think have been the most profoundly affecting your clients?
I don't think I could narrow it down, right? I think that, again, like you said, there's so many nuances, there's so many complexities when it comes to adoption. And I find that in most cases, we're seeing a lot of revolving, moving things going on at the same time. The grief overlaps with the rejection, and the rejection overlaps with the abandonment, and the abandonment overlaps with the identity issues. And like all of these things are happening in tandem. Each individual, maybe certain things are more in the forefront at certain times of your life or during certain developmental stages. Certain things may, be more on the surface. But I think that, if you're really taking a comprehensive approach when working with this population, it's having to be knowing and aware that all of those things are simultaneously occurring. And that is part of what makes this experience so challenging, is there is so much going on at once, and all of it is valid and all of it makes an abundance of sense. But it's having to figure out for that particular individual, which is why there is no one size fits all for adoptees in therapy.
Yeah.
It's having to kind of hone in with that individual on what they are feeling needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and say at the time, and it changes, and it morphs throughout life.
Ebbs and flows. Yep, lots of ebbing and flowing.
Absolutely. And forever. I always liken it to grief. I always say, you never get over grief, but you just learn to live with it and walk alongside it in your life. And there are times when it is worse, and times when it recedes a bit. I was interested in the sentence in the introduction, disassociation through the lifespan. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so I think, again, this goes into the nature of complex trauma, is all of us have the tendency to dissociate out of survival, right? All of us as human beings have the capacity to do that. However, adoptees and those who have experienced really complex trauma have more of a likelihood to utilize that as a survival skill, because it is one that we had available to us when we were very, very small, as opposed to some of the other survival tactics that maybe we would have had if we were a little bit older. And also, it's something that can really just become an everyday way of being if we're not careful and if we're not really attuned to it. So what we're meaning by dissociation is some level of disconnect between our mind and our body, not being able to feel fully present or fully connected to things, especially things that overwhelm our system. I always attune people to the fact that for adoptees, this doesn't just mean that overwhelming things have to be quote unquote bad or negative things. This can actually be that really wonderful experiences can feel overwhelming, that the actual feeling of emotions and the connection to an emotional experience and any of the physiological sensations that go along with that, because of our experience, we have been conditioned to find that really overwhelming because we did not get what we needed when we needed it. And so that is something that can sometimes become a place where a lot of adoptees get stuck in this dissociated state throughout their life that people are not attuned to and mislabel as certain other things. But really it is, if we look closely, a way that the system is still, after many years, right, still trying to survive.
Your work, so as I sit here and listen to you and I think, oh God, if only I'd known that growing up. If only, you still have to deal with it and,
Right.
face it. But if I had known that so many of my instincts and responses were pretty normal for someone in the situation I was in, then you can, okay, let's deal with them. Now let's sort of tackle them.
Right.
But I certainly had no idea. And for children, they're still children, adults even, who aren't seeking help. I think it's so important. First of all, I think you have to go there. I think you have to face this stuff, as difficult as it is, and no matter what you find on the other side, and you have to manage it and work through it. And I always say, get help. It's really hard stuff to deal with. And thank goodness there are therapists like yourself who really understand this, have lived it, and are dealing with it professionally. There's certainly a lot of, groups online to talk to. There are now books to read, but there's nothing like a therapist to help guide you through this, to identify and to sort of validate and affirm that, no, you were in this really crazy situation, and this is how you adapted to it and managed it when you had no how, other way to do it. So, that worked. That was a coping mechanism, not a weakness. And so to see the manifestations of it as a response to a impossible situation and how they helped you survive is a much
Yeah.
better way to view yourself than, oh my God, I'm a mess.
Yeah. Which is hard, especially when you do have society or maybe even people within your own home telling you that those things are wrong, right? Like those are behaviors that often get a pretty bad reputation, that, you are sent to therapy for, to fix, right? That you are blamed for, that you are punished for. And so those are things that can be so challenging because, again, adoptees have internalized so much because we were so small when these experiences happen. As we, grow older, and the way our trauma manifests, maybe becomes difficult for other people, or they don't understand it, it can be very easy for the adoptee then to internalize, well, the way that I am is wrong, right? The way that I'm going through this and coping with this and managing this is wrong, when actually, I attune anybody that I work with is your nervous system was actually acting quite brilliantly, because it's made it so that you are still here, right? It has quite brilliantly stepped up to protect you when you were unable to, or nobody else was doing that, and it got you to this point. And so being able to reframe and shift, and for many adoptees, that's the first time that they're hearing about these behaviors or about these ways of surviving in a way that is affirming, and in a way that is kind and compassionate, and in a way that we can kind of be in awe in, even if we still do want some of those behaviors to shift and change. But like just being able to notice like how incredible it is that our nervous systems are able to jump up and, step up for us in that way.
Yeah, it's much easier to forgive yourself and to affirm some of the power that you may not have understood that you had. It also reminds me how people look at an adoptee who's successful and think that proves that adoption isn't a trauma.
Mhm.
And people still in this world look at external success and equate that. They don't think anyone with external success has internal trauma.
Correct.
And it's hard to believe that we still feel that way, but we do. I've encountered it. Again, I always say, someone who's doing everything right, looks like they're doing everything right, they are a very scared and insecure person. And that's also one of the issues of adoption. You can be the adoptee who just wants to be the perfect child and be
Okay.
loved and protect and safe in that perfection, rather than the rebel who is always testing the boundaries. But your life story is, again, so interesting, your personal experience with this. When did you, and some of the details I certainly don't know, did you always know you were adopted? Did you find out at a later age? And what did you know about your origins?
Yeah, so I always knew that I was adopted. I always prefaced that with, I knew it and understood it to the extent that I was able to at that time, right? Like no 2-year-old knows the complexities of adoption, but my adoption was never was never a secret. So that was something that was always, part of my story. That was something that my adoptive parents were always open and honest about. Given the nature of adoptions during that time in Colombia, I had minimal information. I had little bits and pieces of information, but I did not have by any means the full story of what led to my adoption or any of the really challenging things about just adoptions in general and things like that in Colombia during that time. My parents did what they could in terms of connecting us to our I was lucky to be able to go to Colombia throughout my life, and still to this day I spend a great deal of time there. I split my time between here and Colombia, so that is something that was always very much supported, very much something that my parents felt that was very important. They were helpful in connecting us to our language so that was not something that we had to lose completely. But I always say there is an extent to which they were able to provide things in terms of culture, in terms of racial information, in terms of things that, I would endure that was just not like their life experience. So I think that there were some things that, yes, were very helpful in terms of helping me to connect with my country and with my culture. But I also don't ever feel like that was enough, right? There was still so much that I missed out on, so much that I had to learn as a teenager, as a young adult, so much that I had to grieve that I didn't know or that I didn't understand. And so even for those adoptive parents that do make those attempts to engage and to provide those resources and those things, it still doesn't make up for having lived there and grown up in that country and that culture.
Yeah. Again, that there's just so much, it's so important to us as human beings to have that connection to our family of origin, our biological family, and see ourselves mirrored. And I sometimes try to explain to people, I said, there's a real difference between how you feel if you're sitting around a table with good friends, and they could be really good friends, and you could love these friends very much. And, but that's still a different feeling than sitting around the table with your blood kin. There's just another level of connection. It's something unseen. It's like, animals who can identify their babies, in a sea of others that to us look all identical. There's something we don't understand about this. And it's so true. At the relief, the sense of being filled up, the connection, just the peace and relief you feel when you make that connection with where you came from and you see yourself with your family is something that's very difficult to describe to someone who's always been amongst their family. What age were you when you met your biological mother?
So I was in my early 20s when we met, and obviously there are lots of dynamics, right, that have to go on there as you're having to maintain and, create a relationship very much long distance and being able to figure all of those things out. Unfortunately, during part of that, the COVID pandemic was going on. And so obviously traveling and things like that were not an option. So there were, barriers of our own that we had to face, and being able to foster that connection and make sure that was, something that we were all committed to and on the same page about. And so thankfully now that is not on the table anymore, travel is obviously a big component. And, I validate for many people that are having to manage and nurture relationships in different places, right? But it is an emotional load that many people don't think of, right? I think that just like we talk about the narrative of adoption being so, rosy and butterfly-ish, that is the narrative of reunion too. And I'm always, very honest and validate for people that like not every reunion story is like that. There are, tragic reunion stories. There are reunion stories that don't get to happen. And even the ones that do get to happen, they are still not without a lot of challenges and sometimes more questions than answers, and things that you're really having to process and find out. It's a challenge. It's a whole other chapter of challenges. And so I think that that's another area where people are leaning more towards a one-sided narrative and not to the complexity of like what that actual experience is.
Sometimes that is also used as an excuse, like, oh, you shouldn't search. What if you find something awful? It's like you have to know everything. You can't be yourself if you don't know the good and bad and the ugly. And yes, it takes a lot to process it. I had one nice reunion story and one very painful reunion story. But I needed both of them to really know myself and understand and get all the pieces of the puzzle and sort of
Yeah.
put them together with then my adoption experience. And where you end up is you're not really a part of your adopted family because you don't share blood with them and you feel that all the time. And you're also not really part of your biological families because you don't have memories with them and you don't have a lived history. And so you end up being this person who has a foot kind of in a few different families. And even if as an adult you have, a marriage and children and your own family, there's still this foundational feeling of being alone ultimately, that there's a lot you're navigating and there's a lot to integrate, but also without doing that work, you stay that adopted child, to be a grown up and to be as self-reliant and integrated as possible. You have to know the good, the bad, and the ugly can be a good cautionary tale for you. There may be aspects of yourself you didn't realize were so biological, and you need to know that. So I always say, you can't be afraid of what you're going to find, that you have to be aware that it takes work to process all of that. There's help out there to help do that. But if you do it, you're going to feel more authentic than you ever have in your life. But it's complicated. There's a lot of moving.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and much more complicated when you're doing it as an adult, right? And not that it's not complicated when you're doing that as a child, but this is where I always advocate for. This is where, even yes, young children need to know the truth about their stories and need to know that good, the bad, and the ugly in order to be able to integrate that so that again, it doesn't take the pain away, and it doesn't mean that it's not still so difficult and something that has to be grieved, but to be able to have that information and mold that into your brain and your identity when you're young, it does make a difference than having to do that as an adult when things have already kind of settled and an identity has been formed. It's much more difficult then.
And what have we not talked about that you would like to talk about?
Wow, that's always a loaded question. No, I mean, I think that this has been, these are conversations that are so important. And I think it's also important to know that these conversations also, they scratch the surface, right? And I think that this is the place where if people are listening to this conversation and there are bits and pieces of what we have said that make them uncomfortable or that, are causing some kind of reaction internally, those would be the places where I'd encourage them to lean in more. Those are the places where there's a reason that you are having a reaction to something that has been said. And maybe it is something within your own history. Maybe it is something that you are fearful of. Maybe it is some kind of experience you went through and some of this is rubbing up against that. But, these conversations are wonderful and they're so needed and so important. And it also doesn't mean that this is where the learning stops. And we want people being able to take the initiative to dig deeper and not have it have to be something where we as the adoptees are holding your hand through it all. There needs to be initiative when it's not just an adoptee that's there to show you the ropes.
Yes, exactly. And I hope when I wrote my book that it was just going to start conversations. I think if we can just raise awareness that adoption isn't what you think it is, and this is real trauma, culturally unrecognized trauma. I always like that saying that it's the only trauma and where the victims are expected to be grateful. We have to really look at this. We really have to culturally change how we view it and how we deal with it, because it is already hurt so many people, but it's continuing in issues like donor conceived individuals and reproductive rights. And there's so many aspects of identity and belonging, and that we need to learn from the experience of those that had that taken from us, that we can do better at all the things that we're facing now and going forward, even if they're no longer closed adoptions. Open adoption isn't the answer either. And still this real divide between not supporting birth mothers who want to keep their children, but giving tax incentives to adoptive parents. I mean, there's so much inequity in this institution, and there's so much money behind this institution. And we have to recognize that so we can make changes. And so I'm hoping these conversations raise awareness and start people questioning and thinking differently about the image they hold. Where can people find you and learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram, as you mentioned. It is at Marcella Moslow. So just my first name and my last name. I keep it short and simple. My website is also just www.marcellamoslow.com. So that's where you can find information on clinical services, on consulting, on trainings, things like that. And then I also co-host a podcast called Adoptees Dish with fellow trauma therapist and adoptee Amy Wilkerson. And that is available on iTunes, on Spotify, and on iHeartRadio.
I really enjoyed that, by the way. Thank you for mentioning that. I listened to some of your episodes, and I think you guys are really refreshing as you talk back and forth very, very candidly and very
That's a good word for us. Yes, we're very refreshing.
No, and just like two friends talking, and like we get to listen in. But I listened in one episode that I was listening to yesterday when you were talking about names, and that really resonated with me because when I first discovered that I had been given a name and had a name when I was adopted and wasn't just, baby girl, it really affected me. I felt like, oh my God, I really was somebody else.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was powerful. So I encourage everyone to listen to that. It's great.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for speaking with me today. We did just scratch the surface. There's
There's
much
more conversations to come, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be lots of them.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your time today. I encourage everyone to look at your Instagram and listen to your podcast. They're really terrific. As an adoptee, they really resonate with me. It really affirmed my experiences, and I'm very grateful that you put them out there. Thanks so much, Marcella.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Adoption. I'm your host, Janet Sherland. You can find me at abandonedatbirthbook.com or on Instagram at Janet Sherland Official. My book, Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me, is available on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and bookshop.org, and hopefully anywhere books are sold. Thank you so much.